Today, I think many Americans, perhaps not all, but most Americans take as axiomatic that race and gender should have no place in arbitrating political rights or political power. But for most of our history, Black women are nearly alone, right, in setting that high bar and holding it there. We, as a nation, are still catching up with that vision.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Freddie Kay, and I'm the founder and president of Suffrage 100 Massachusetts, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to sharing the story of the suffragists, especially the history of the many women and men of color who worked tirelessly for the vote. Suffrage 100 MA has over 200 nonprofit organizations. I'll take just a moment to highlight our two most recent partners, the Greater Boston section of the National Council of Negro Women. Suffrage 100 MA was so pleased to partner with them on their recent event about Edmonia Lewis and the United States postal stamp in her honor and memory. And another recent partner is the Frances Perkins Center. With that, I'm honored to introduce Professor Martha S. Jones. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. I'd like to add that in addition to Martha's fabulous book that we are discussing this evening, Vanguard, Martha appears in many documentaries on PBS, Netflix, and elsewhere. Her work is so important, and we're very honored to have you with us tonight, Professor Jones. I'm also extremely pleased to introduce Charlotte Golar Richie, who will be interviewing Martha. Charlotte has spent 25 years in government as a former state legislator, civil rights commissioner, housing chief, and neighborhood development director. Since her groundbreaking campaign in 2013 as the first African-American woman to run for mayor of Boston, Charlotte has dedicated her time to board and philanthropic activities and uplifting the leadership efforts of women and people of color, including with many organizations that are Suffrage 100 MA partners. Charlotte is a dear friend and colleague, and we're so thrilled that she's interviewing Martha. I must note that Martha's work and this important and fabulous book, Vanguard, directly align with Suffrage 100 MA and our mission to shine a light on the enormous contributions to American democracy of the suffrage movement in the broadest sense. We strive to shine a light on all the women and men who fought for the vote up to and including the 19th Amendment and beyond, to enable African Americans, Latinx Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans to vote, such as the all-important Voting Rights Act of 1965. Our hope is that the general public comes to know this history, this herstory, so that more people will appreciate and exercise their right to vote, particularly with the current increasing restrictions on voting, which we must work against. It is critical that everyone votes. And finally, before I turn it over to Charlotte, this event turns out to be very timely with the nomination to the United States Supreme Court of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, KBJ, as she's being referred to. And today's great news that Senator Susan Collins of Maine has announced that she will be supporting Judge Jackson's nomination. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Charlotte and Martha. Thank you.
Thank you, Freddie, and good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be able to collaborate with you, Freddie, and yes, you are a dear friend, and I appreciate your work with Suffrage 100 Massachusetts. And my ability to partner with you is due to my connection with three key organizations: the Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition, the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus, and the UMass Boston Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. Welcome, Martha Jones. We are so excited to be part of this conversation with you. It's wonderful that you could join us this evening to talk about your book, Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. With Vanguard, you have done us a great service. I truly believe that. It's kind of what I call rewriting history. That's RIGHT. Your book includes many women whose contributions have been under-acknowledged or entirely omitted from our history books, a fact that Time magazine did note in 2020, as Freddie mentioned, when they included Vanguard on its list of 100 books that we must be sure to read. And after watching last week's Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, Vanguard should be included on the 2022 must-read list as well. Please, let's start from the beginning. And if you could just share with us a little bit about Vanguard's genesis. Why did you decide to write this book at this particular time?
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. I feel like I should turn the tables because you really are the continuation of the story of Vanguard with your own remarkable public service, record of distinction, and more. So I'm deeply honored to be with you. I thank the GBH Forum Network, and of course, Suffrage 100 Massachusetts, and our friend Freddie K, everybody in front of the camera and behind the scenes for this opportunity. And you have to know that as I was finishing Vanguard in the early or late fall, really, of 2019, I could not have imagined how the stories I tell in this book would be resonating all the way until this moment. So I cannot pretend that I was so prescient that I understood how this book helps us to understand the nomination and the rise of Judge Brown Jackson at this very moment in time. What I was thinking about as I embarked on this book was the year 2020 and the impending centennial of the 19th Amendment. We were going to celebrate 100 years of women's votes. And still, I began to, there were signs that in the midst of efforts to celebrate, Black women might be overlooked. Why? Because part of the story that I tell in this book is about the ways in which anti-Black racism ran through too much of the suffrage movement and of the 19th Amendment as a disappointment for African-American women, too many of whom remain disenfranchised without the vote, even after a federal amendment. So this was a book that I hope would be picked up by students, by journalists, by commentators, by celebrants, and more in 2020. But as you've already alluded to, it turned out that we needed this book to understand that extraordinary election cycle that, among other things, brings us Vice President Kamala Harris. And it continues, I think, to help us understand the force that Black women are today in American politics.
So I would say most of us, I think it's safe to say most of us have a working knowledge of abolitionist, orator, and women's rights champion Sojourner Truth. And of course, we know about Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman. With Vanguard, you've helped to expand our base of knowledge, whereby we meet many other Black women who work to end slavery and advance the cause of women's rights, including this important right to vote. Several of these women, as it turns out, have had a connection, a strong connection to Massachusetts. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, starting with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who in her day, she was a poet and a lecturer, a political commentator. She was from Maryland, yet she spent some time in Boston and Roxbury, which is the heart of the Black community in the city of Boston. She was in Lowell, she was in Framingham. So if you could tell us about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and why is she someone that we need to know?
Well, thank you for that opening. She was indeed a native Baltimorean, which is my hometown. So I think we come to her through that sense of pride. But that geography is the beginning of a story. Born in a slave state, a free woman, educated in the city of Baltimore, she leaves to herself become an educator, initially in Pennsylvania. But by the 1840s and into the 1850s, Frances Harper is blossoming, as you said, into a poet, publishing her first slim collection of poems. And she is quickly recognized by folks who are organizing the anti-slavery lecture circuit. She's recognized for her elegant and powerful oratory. And so by the 1850s, she's touring alongside men, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. She is a peer to them. In our story, she is certainly a woman who breaks barriers, as the title of the book suggests, but she's also someone who really, by the 1860s, is laying the foundation for a distinctly Black woman's political philosophy about why the vote, what the stakes are in voting rights. And it turns out her ideas differ importantly from ones we are more familiar with, those of Susan Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Frederick Douglass or Wendell Phillips. So she really is laying the foundation in her own work, frankly, for the kind of intersectional thinking that we associate with the 21st century. Frances Harper is already there by the 1860s.
So you're going to read a passage from chapter 4. We're very excited about that. And that will give us a sense of the enormous challenges that Black women activists had to contend with during the 1800s as they traveled to and from meetings and events. And in Frances Harper's case, it was the terror of the ladies' car. So I'd love to hear about this, and I'm sure our audience will too.
Thank you. So it's 1866, and we're at the meeting during which the American Equal Rights Association is founded. This is an old coalition of abolitionists and women's rights advocates who are now coming together to try and figure out their position politically, particularly when it comes to voting rights. Harper came to express her solidarity with the interests of women. This is her. Justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. She also championed a distinctly Black women's movement that emanated from the perils of travel that they were obliged to endure. Going from Washington to Baltimore this spring, they put me in the smoking car. I, in the capital of the nation, where the Black man consecrated himself to the nation's defense, where the faithful when the white man was faithless, they put me in the smoking car. They did it once, but the next time they tried it, they failed. I would not go in. I felt the fight in me, but I don't want to have to fight all the time. She pushed back against such indignities, even as they plagued her. What women's movement, Harper asked, would countenance brutality directed at Black women? Have women nothing to do with this? It was the strife of streetcars and railroads that were the root of Harper's notions about women's rights. She continued, not long since, a colored woman took her seat in a 11th Street car in Philadelphia, and the conductor stopped the car and told the rest of the passengers to get out, and left the car with her in it alone when they took it back to the station. No measure of respectability was enough. One day, I took my seat in a car, and the conductor came to me and told me to take another seat. I just screamed murder. The man said, if I was Black, I ought to behave myself. I knew that if he was white, he was not behaving himself. Are there no wrongs to be righted? This was the question Harper had come to ask of the American Equal Rights Association, of white women, including Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and of white men, such as Wendell Phillips and Henry Ward Beecher.
Thank you for that. So, Martha, you know that when we talk about or think about discrimination on transportation conveyances, we immediately are thinking about Rosa Parks and her refusal to move to the back of a public bus. However, your book illustrates how Rosa Parks was part of a very long tradition of Black women who refused to comply with segregation laws by giving up their seats on trains, on steamships, on streetcars, even if it meant risking bodily harm. It's fascinating to learn about the political barriers that women faced. In the way you tell it, you're a great storyteller. So it was in public places, but we also find they had barriers to break through within the church establishment. You tell us a lot about that kind of experience that women in the 1800s confronted. And you tell us about Julia Foote and Mary Small, who were the first women ministers in the AME Zion Church. And you describe the subsequent firestorm that erupted soon after their ascension in the hierarchy. And then we meet Emily Bird Walters, who came to their defense. So Martha, in this next passage, I would love to, we're going to be excited for you to tell us and excited for us to learn how the women of the 1800s, like Emily Bird Walters, valued solidarity in much the same way that we recognize its importance today.
Thank you for that. I think some readers may be surprised about the centrality of church in this story. But it turns out that the Black church really is a crucible, both for the development of ideas and for the development of political strategies. And by the 1890s, young women, a new generation of women like Emily Bird Walters, are joining the struggle for women's rights. Bird Walters wrote emphatically, she had to. A maelstrom had erupted when the two women, Foote and Small, rose to the pinnacle of ministerial authority, ordained as deacons with full rights to preach, preside, and participate in church governance. If this breakthrough was to survive its opponents, it would do so only if advocates and allies stepped into the fray. Women in AME Zion had been talking about their rights for decades. Their strides were evident, and still there were those who aimed to halt their progress and impose a ceiling, preserving the highest offices for men alone. Two women who had long labored for the church, and some argued deserved their ordination by right, inspired the charge against sexism. Foote was the more seasoned of the two, Her career had a rough start when in the 1830s, her minister expelled her from a Connecticut congregation for holding prayer meetings without his permission. Her response was to organize with other women and petition for a license. To prove her calling was genuine and her skills formidable, Foote held open air meetings where women demonstrated their capacity to attract converts. In 1879, Foote recounted this rocky beginning in a spiritual memoir, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, an autobiographical sketch. With a book in hand, Foote's public work was newly launched, and by the early 1880s, she was crisscrossing the country and logging thousands of miles as a much sought after evangelist, a featured speaker who drew the lapsed, reluctant, and curious into Methodism. She need not preach churchwomen's rights to endorse that cause. As one commentator in Topeka, Kansas put it, Foote's presence encourages our women. Too many of them believe, as the men do, that a woman should not preach, not occupy a public position in the church.
So we learn the experiences of Emily Bird Walters, Julia Foote, Mary Small, that they could achieve positions of authority, of power, but they also needed a base of support to help hold them up and ensure that they did not lose their positions of authority. I want to sort of shift over to the effort of women to achieve voting rights. 2 years ago, around the time that Vanguard was being published, many of us in Massachusetts commemorated the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and we recognize that outrageously, it took another 45 years for all Black women across the United States to be able to exercise this right to vote. We grew up, and I'll say we, Freddie and I were kind of talking about this before the program, that she and I certainly grew up, we understanding the smarts and the courage and the persistence of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were central figures in the effort to obtain passage of the 19th Amendment. In Vanguard, Martha, you are educating us about the Black women suffragists. These are women who are smart and courageous and persistent leaders in the voting rights movement, as much as Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And unfortunately, we didn't get to know about them. I wonder if there are highlights regarding these women, the contributions of these women that you would like to emphasize while we have this opportunity in this program, including the role of your favorite suffragist, Ida B. Wells Barnett.
Yes. So here is a generation of Black women born, many of them just in the years as slavery is being abolished, as Reconstruction is attempting an interracial democracy, coming of age at the end of the 19th century. They are writers, they are educators, they are institution builders, they are anti-lynching advocates, and a great deal more. They are suffragists. Ida Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, and so many others. But they are not only suffragists. And I think this helps us understand perhaps how they've been overlooked for so long. It is to say that these were not women who had the luxury or the inclination to commit themselves to winning women's votes alone. They needed to do the work of civil rights. They needed to do the work of criminal justice reform. They needed to do the work of economic justice, especially in the years as Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, violence, as those years gain a footing in the United States, Black women need to work through this multifaceted agenda. They do not join the organizations now that are being recreated by women like Carrie Chapman Catt and later Alice Paul. Instead, they found their own. And among them is the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Yes, those women are suffragists. They run a suffrage department, but they do so much more in those years. It tells us a great deal about the broad human rights perspective that Black women bring to politics, leaving no one behind, lifting as they climb, which is their motto, companions, but only awkward companions to white suffragists in that campaign that takes us to ultimately ratification of the 19th Amendment.
Can you talk a little more about the situation that Black women found themselves in? They were kind of between a rock and a hard place when they tried to seek out their allies, whether it was for Black men, white women, and even among themselves. There was the friction among Black women about what the strategy should be. There was an understanding that there should be a strategy, but what should it be, right? And I think their white sisters were also grappling with this notion that we need to pull in as many women as we can, even if that meant that we were the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, might be the Black women. Can you dig in a little bit more deeply into that and help to have us illustrate what was going on at that time? Sure.
I'll take you to a moment that might be familiar to some folks tuning in. It's 1913, and Alice Paul has joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She's part of a radical cadre of women in Washington, D.C., and she persuades Carrie Chapman Catt to permit her to organize a women's parade. It's 1913. Woodrow Wilson is slated to be inaugurated that March in Washington, and Alice Paul plans a women's parade, an unprecedented gathering for the day before Wilson's inauguration. Well, when we look more closely at the planning for that meeting, we see the deep ambivalences that white women bring to that occasion when it comes to Black suffragists. On the one hand, they are trying to, if you will, bring out as many bodies as possible, right? They want this to be an enormous march. They want this to be a gathering that no one can ignore. So they reach out tentatively to Black women. At the same time, what surfaces is the concern that Southern suffragists will refuse to participate in a gathering, including a parade that includes Black women on equal terms. Well, the result is a very awkward occasion. A few dozen Black women, as best we know, do show up to that parade. They are highly visible. Ida Wells, whom you've mentioned, endures direct indignity when she is instructed to march separate from the Illinois state delegation with whom she has traveled all the way to Washington. It is a really tough day for Black suffragists, whether they are seasoned like Mary Church Terrell or they are the students, sorority members from Howard University, young women who are coming to the suffrage politics for the first time. But what we learn is that A, Black women are indeed deeply committed suffragists, but B, they are not going to cede the suffrage question and the trajectory of women's votes wholly to someone like Alice Paul, who goes on record as saying she just wished Black women would stay home and let her steer their political destinies. And that is a bridge too far for someone like Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells. But this gives you a sense of the tension because the perception is that you cannot pass a 19th Amendment out of Congress without the support of Southern lawmakers. And the calculus on the part of women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul is that the way to win the support of Southerners is to press to the margins and ultimately promise that nothing in the terms of the 19th Amendment will prevent Southern states from disenfranchising Black women, just as they have already done with respect to Black men.
So now the amendment is ratified and there's victory, but it's a long slog for Black women, and it has taken decades. And now, of course, the irony is now we're looking at some of the same issues around voter suppression in present day that Black people and men and women were grappling with then. Can you walk us through, the sort of quickly with the time that we have, those
Sure.
decades? Yeah.
Absolutely. The 19th Amendment is a milestone, but a disappointment for Black women. And when they look out across the political landscape after the November election cycle in 1920, it's clear that too many Black women have been disenfranchised by violence and intimidation, by poll taxes, by literacy tests, by grandfather clauses, and more. They need a campaign, and they reorganize in the name of women's votes in a struggle that takes them 45 years hence to the Voting Rights Act. Through being in the trenches on election day, registering, casting ballots, getting those ballots counted, becoming operatives in the then Republican Party in order to affect the outcome of elections. And they succeed in some places, like in Ida B. Wells's Chicago. There is the legal campaign being waged by the NAACP and later the Legal Defense Fund, using the Constitution to chip away at Jim Crow strictures like poll taxes, like whites-only primaries, like grandfather clauses. And then finally, of course, there is the Civil Rights Revolution. And by the 1940s, now Black women are the foot soldiers, but also the architects, the strategists, and the faces of a civil rights revolution that is going to, I think we could say, hold the feet of Congress, of Lyndon Johnson by 1965, and the nation as a whole, right, to the fire of Black voting rights. And so the greats, Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, Ella Baker, and so many more are essential leaders in that revolution that ultimately takes us, yes, to the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, so I know you have one more passage that you're going to share with us. I think we have time for that. I think sticking to this topic of voting rights, but fast forwarding now to 1965, please, tell us what you discovered when you found a photograph of the signing of the Voting Rights Act.
Yes. This photograph was a puzzle because while I think the men might be familiar faces to many folks, the women in this image, not only did I not know their names, this photo comes from the Lyndon Johnson archives, and the women, even in the archival record, were not identified. 3 Black women stepped forward, illuminated by the flash of camera bulbs during the signing ceremony for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Photographers swarmed and jockeyed to capture just the right pantheon of faces from among those gathered to mark the moment when federal law committed the nation to protecting Black Americans' access to the ballot. Not since the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870 had the United States so boldly affirmed that racism must not compromise membership in political culture. These were images that not only would circulate on the pages of the nation's newspapers, but also would be preserved in archives, in a patrimony, evidence of how a new political order had been forged out of an old struggle. While the women's names were nearly lost by those who otherwise preserved the moment, the men in the scene are well remembered for their roles in the quest for voting rights. There was President Lyndon Johnson signing the act into law, handing out ceremonial pens and shaking hands. For Johnson, this event punctuated his victory over Southern Democrats who had long aimed to block civil rights legislation. Standing to Johnson's left were a trio of Black leaders, men who stood at the helm of the movement's establishment. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy represented the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and were credited with sponsoring Selma's decisive voting rights campaign. Clarence Mitchell was the chief lobbyist of the NAACP and was responsible for behind-the-scenes work in Washington, D.C. that transformed an ideal into the text of a congressional act. The three women standing just to the left of Clarence Mitchell had their own stories to tell about voting rights. First, their names. Patricia Roberts Harris was a law professor at Howard University and a party ally to Lyndon Johnson, having seconded his nomination for president at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Harris's political education began under the mentorship of Pauli Murray. The two had collaborated on the sit-ins led by Howard University students in 1943. Standing to Harris's far left was Vivian Malone, who staffed the voter education project at the U.S. Department of Justice. She had recently migrated from Montgomery, Alabama to Washington, D.C., one of two Black women students who defied Governor George Wallace and integrated the University of Alabama. 2 years later, in 1965, Malone became the school's first Black graduate. And the third woman, Zephyr Wright, was the Johnson family's cook, having long traveled between their homes in Texas and Washington, D.C. When Wright sat with the Johnson family during the president's first address to Congress just weeks after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, it signaled that her advice extended beyond culinary preparations to issues of race and justice. Commentators tried to characterize Wright as a servant in an effort to illustrate the Johnson family's home life, but Wright, a graduate of Wiley College, had long advised the president about the discrimination she endured when traveling and in Washington's restaurants. Her story was part of Johnson's own and a foundation for his commitment to civil rights. I was well into this book when I became very self-conscious that I didn't know how the women in my own family fit into this story. I took a quiet detour. I didn't tell my editor, but it was time to do some looking into the women who came before me, the women who made who I am possible in just absolutely literal ways. And that road took me back to Nancy Bell Graves, born enslaved, we believe, in 1808, Danville, Kentucky. I was able to follow the trajectory of Nancy's daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters, my own grandmother. I'm sitting tonight in Greensboro, North Carolina, where my grandmother, Susie Jones, was wife to Bennett College president, David Jones, Bennett being a historically Black women's college. And I found my own grandmother in an interview in 1976, explaining how thrilling, as she put it, it was to do the work of voting rights. But she didn't speak of the 1920s. That's important. Though she was a young woman then, she was likely unable to vote. She was speaking of the 1950s and 1960s, because that is when the young women students at Bennett joined the community here in Greensboro to launch Operation Door Knock and to ensure that Black voters in Greensboro are registered, ensure that they get to the polls. This is the modern civil rights story. So the women in my family are surely inspirations, and they are also keys to the story I tell in Vanguard. Because if I had ended this book in 1920 conventionally with the milestone of the 19th Amendment, I would have missed that thrilling moment in my own grandmother's life, the 1950s and 60s, and that chapter in the struggle for women's votes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you, Martha and Charlotte. That was just Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. That was just great. And we do have some questions that I want to be sure to ask you. And I'm trying to keep track of these here if I can. So I'm learning this, make sure I'm on this technology okay. One is a question that I saw that I loved, which is Charles is asking, will there be a follow-up to Vanguard? He's reading the book and doesn't want to finish it, doesn't want to end. And I can totally relate to that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will say that the paperback edition of the book was released in December of 2020. And my editor permitted me to add a new preface that brought the story up through the election cycle of 2020, from the role of Black women organizers, Black women voters, the election of Vice President Harris, and even young Amanda Gorman and her inaugural poem presentation. Amanda Gorman, who quite seriously explains she intends to run for president of the United States when she ultimately comes of age. But you are so right to underscore that this story is still being written. And I hope that part of what readers take away is a sharper ear for those moments when Black women do take to the podium. I'll come back to someone you've already mentioned, Freddie, Judge Brown Jackson. Well, during her confirmation hearing, Judge Jackson says, I stand on the shoulders of who? Constance Baker Motley. Judge Motley is the first Black woman appointed to the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson. But prior to that, she is a member of that NAACP litigation team that is chipping away at Jim Crow barriers to voting rights for Black Americans. Listening to Black women as they tell their own stories is one way for us to honor the ethos, right, of Vanguard. Because when we listen in and we listen carefully, they are eager, these Black women in political life, in public life, in leadership, to tell us about the shoulders on which they stand.
Which connects it all, right? I mean, which is a way of saying that what is happening today is not in and of itself. There is such a connection between this history that you have shared with us here and where we are today, and all of the issues that go along with that. To understand perhaps and put in perspective the questioning that Judge Jackson has endured and how she was treated, frankly. So the connection between all of that, that says it's still with us.
Yeah, if I could say, Freddie, I think that one of the things in some ways that has changed is that I think in 1920, for too many Americans, a Black woman voter, a Black woman office holder is unthinkable. For too many white Americans, it is just unimaginable. Well, that's not true in 2020. That we've broken those barriers. We've remade those molds. But I do think that part of where Judge Jackson has been sort of caught, right, is in the problem of imagination, facing senators, for example, whose imaginations do not allow for the possibility of a Black woman as a member of that esteemed bench, 9 justices at the US Supreme Court. She's changing our imaginations, but I think she's also coming up against the inability of people to see that possibility.
Thank you. There are some questions coming in I want to be sure to ask you as well. There's a question from Gloria. Are there women from or living in the Deep South involved in the early women voting rights movement?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned the great Mary McLeod Bethune, born in 1875 in South Carolina. By the early 20th century, she has resettled in Daytona, Florida. Bethune is an educator. She founds a girls' school, which is today Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona. Bethune is a suffragist, a member of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, an organizer in Florida, importantly in the fall of 1920, as women are preparing for the likelihood that they will be able to register and cast ballots that fall. Mrs. Bethune faces extraordinary, unbridled violence, Ku Klux Klan violence, in the face of her voting rights organizing. Election eve in 1920, the Klan will assemble in downtown Daytona, march on horseback in full regalia onto the grounds of her girls' school, in an effort to intimidate Mrs. Bethune, in an effort to intimidate her faculty and the Black women of Daytona, whom she has helped to organize and get to the polls. The Klan doesn't succeed in 1920, and Black women will turn out and cast their ballots under harrowing conditions, but they will do so. But by 1922, the violence in Florida remains so wanton and so unchecked. The 19th Amendment does nothing to equip Black women with the legal tools that might permit them to resist that violence. And even someone as courageous and as brilliant, frankly, as Mrs. Bethune will step away from the front lines of voting rights in 1922.
Thank you. We have a question from Celia, who makes some nice comments, and she's very pleased with the forum. Thank you, Celia. And she writes, we as Black women are still experiencing blatant racism in our daily lives. How did the sisters in your book find the time to relieve the stress and heal? What strategies are still relevant today to organize and build power?
Thank you so much for that question, Celia. As we mentioned earlier, many of the women in this book have active, deep, and important lives in their faith communities. And this is a source of strength. It is a source of authority. It is a source of collective, right, organizing and community that undergirds the work that the women I write about do. I highly recommend the new work from historian Stephanie Evans. Dr. Evans at Georgia State University has written about Black women activists and what we call in 21st century parlance self-care. For example, Rosa Parks practiced yoga, something we might not know about her, but was part of Mrs. Parks' a key, right, to her longevity, and a model, I think, for us, a sort of model for us about how we sustain ourselves. The last thing I'll say is that there is something very powerful about, if I could put it this way, being right, being correct. And the women in this book are correct, and they know it. When they speak about democracy, when they speak about voting rights, they speak in human rights terms, they speak in expansive terms. They are breathing life into the sorts of ideals, right, that were thrust onto the table in the years of the American Revolution. And they know they are right about what democracy can be and should be. And while it's not a source of arrogance exactly, it is a source of deep inspiration. Even it is also a tremendous burden to understand. They understand themselves to be the essential agents of American democracy.
And I hear that as when we hear about being on the right side of history.
Mm.
Am I right? That's what you're talking about. Is
Absolutely. Today, I think many Americans, perhaps not all, but most Americans take as axiomatic that race and gender should have no place in arbitrating political rights or political power. But for most of our history, Black women are nearly alone, right, in setting that high bar and holding it there. We, as a nation, right, are still catching up with that vision.
We have a question from Lori. Can you talk more about how young Black women were involved in the movement?
Absolutely. There are a few ways to think about that story, Lori. On the one hand, there are daughters in this book. Mary Church Terrell, who names her daughter Phyllis for the great 18th century enslaved poet in Boston, Phyllis Wheatley. She takes her daughter Phyllis on the road with her, on the lecture circuit, giving her a kind of political education. And many of the women in this book, Frances Harper, Ida Wells, and others, deeply devoted to their daughters, and folding their daughters into a political tradition is one way that we see young women. The second way is that we see young women as students, whether they're at Wilberforce University in Ohio, where so many Black suffragists are on the faculty, or at the M Street High School in Washington, the fabled M Street High School, where women like Mary Church Terrell and Anna Julia Cooper are on the faculty and raising up young women. We see them there. I mentioned the remarkable Black women sorority members who are part, for example, of Alice Paul's 1913 parade. The women in this book, many of them understand that they may not live long enough to see the wholesale fulfillment of their political objectives. And so we can discern how they are educating, training, and preparing next generations of girls who will become women. And when someone like Representative Barbara Lee in Congress today tells the story of, in California, as a young woman meeting with who? Shirley Chisholm. It is the story that helps us understand that the torch is always being passed. Women are bringing on young women, girls, into this story in essential ways. It is the only way in which this movement has a kind of continuity over, it turns out, 200 plus years in this story.
Oh my goodness. So much to talk about. We are basically out of time. A couple of things to add. For people who have questions, if you want to say, we'll try to save them and try to figure out a way to get answers for you. You can also email us at suffrage100ma.org, and we'll try to take care of that as well. I want to encourage people to go on our website and sign up for our emails. If you don't, we don't send many, but they're good, or we try to make them good. And on our website, and also, of course, to go to Martha Jones' website, because she has one and it's wonderful. And I encourage you to see that. I hope you will purchase this incredible book. I want to add a couple of things that we hope that we will be having more events and that you will join us for them. One thing that's coming up, I'm delighted to announce, is that there have been 5 historic roadside markers that have been approved as a part of the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites. It's a part of the National Votes for Women Trail, and Suffrage 100 MA has been very involved with them in identifying 5 markers that are going to come to Massachusetts. And they include, out of the 5, 3 are actually of color, which is wonderful. Mariah Baldwin in Cambridge, Ann L. Page in Danvers, Sojourner Truth will be in Northampton, the Remond family to recognize that Charles Remond was in your book, and Sarah and their sister Caroline, I think it is. So a fabulous family to also be recognized in Sarah Wall. And those, we'll be announcing those. There'll be unveilings and events around those, and we hope everyone can join us. In closing, I would just like to add, if I might, that these are times that I think do call for inspiration. And I'd like to end with a quote from Coretta Scott King. Women, if the soul of the nation is to be saved, I believe that you must become its soul. Thank you so much again, Professor Jones. This has been fantastic. Charlotte Golar Richie, thank you. Thank you to GBH Network Forum, behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, Suffrage 100 MA staff and board, and to everyone tonight for joining us. We really appreciate it. And this will be recorded and is recorded, and we look forward to sharing with you. Thank you, everyone.